high in the Colorado Rockies, where the air cuts like broken glass and avalanches swallow entire mountainsides. 73-year-old Samuel Creek lay dying in the snow. The blizzard had come from nowhere, and now hypothermia was stealing his strength one heartbeat at a time. For 4 decades, Sam had been the mountain's guardian angel, the man who rappelled down impossible cliffs and crawled through collapsing ice caves to bring lost souls home. 317 successful rescues. Not one life lost on his watch. But now Sam's own time was running out. His legs had given out completely. Frostbite was claiming his fingers. The radio was dead, and darkness was falling fast. That's when Ezra, his 30-year-old donkey, did something that defied everything Sam thought he knew about the world. The old animal's eyes began to glow with an otherworldly light, and suddenly the mountain itself seemed to respond to his call. What ancient secret had Sam's faithful companion been hiding all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sam's breath came in ragged puffs that crystallized instantly in the frigid air. Through the swirling snow, he watched Ezra approach with measured steps, those luminescent eyes cutting through the storm like twin beacons. The donkey's usually grey coat seemed to shimmer with an inner warmth, steam rising from his flanks despite the sub-zero temperature. "Ezra," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Get out of here, old friend. Save yourself." But the donkey had never listened to orders, not in all their years together. Ezra had been Sam's constant companion since the day a young park ranger had found him abandoned as a foal near Pikes Peak. Now, as Sam's vision blurred and his consciousness wavered, he could swear he heard something impossible. Ezra's voice, not spoken but somehow transmitted directly into his mind. "Hold on, Samuel. The mountain remembers its debts." The voice was ancient, carrying the weight of centuries. Sam forced his eyes open wider, certain he was hallucinating. Hypothermia could do that, make a man hear things that weren't there. But the warmth spreading through his chest felt real enough, and the way the wind began to shift around them was no fever dream. Ezra stepped closer, his glowing eyes fixed on Sam's face. The snow beneath the donkey's hooves melted instantly, revealing patches of green grass that had no business existing in this frozen wasteland. With each step, the temperature around them seemed to rise a degree or two. "You have given so much to this mountain," the voice continued, filling Sam's head with its resonant tones. "Every soul you saved, every risk you took, the mountain felt it all, and I have been watching, waiting." Sam's mind reeled. In 40 years of mountain rescue, he'd seen plenty of things that couldn't be explained by textbooks or training. He'd found lost hikers in places they shouldn't have survived, watched impossible weather patterns part just long enough for a helicopter extraction, felt the mountain's moods shift in ways that seemed almost sentient. But he'd always attributed it to experience, to understanding the land's rhythms after decades of careful observation. Ezra lowered his great head, his warm breath melting the ice crystals forming on Sam's beard. The donkey's eyes pulsed brighter, and suddenly Sam felt sensation returning to his frozen limbs. The burning cold in his fingers began to fade, replaced by a tingling warmth that spread up his arms. "I'm older than you know," Ezra's voice explained, patient as stone. "Older than the trees, older than the snow. I have walked these peaks since before men gave them names, and I have been waiting for one worthy of the mountain's trust." Sam tried to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions flooding his mind, but only a croak emerged. Ezra seemed to understand anyway. "Your grandfather knew," the donkey continued. "Thomas Creek, who guided prospectors through Devil's Canyon in 1882. He found me then, wounded and alone, and nursed me back to health. I gave him 30 years of faithful service, and when his time came, I waited. I waited for another Creek who would serve the mountain as he did." The storm was weakening around them now, the wind dropping to a whisper. Sam could see stars beginning to peek through the clouds, and impossibly, The snow beneath his body felt almost warm. Every rescue you made, I was there. Sometimes you saw me in your peripheral vision, a grey shadow keeping pace. Sometimes I was the lucky wind that held your rope steady, or the instinct that told you to check one more crevice. The mountain works through those who serve it. Ezra's eyes flared brighter, and Sam felt strength flooding back into his body. His legs, which had been completely numb, began to respond to his commands, the frostbite retreating from his fingers like a tide going out. But tonight, subtle help is not enough. Tonight, the mountain calls in its debt. The wind screamed across the mountainside like a banshee, driving snow so thick that Petra could barely see her own hooves. She pressed her muzzle close to Marcus's face, feeling the shallow puffs of his breath against her whiskers. Still alive, but barely. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor she'd seen too many times before, the look of hypothermia claiming another victim. But Marcus wasn't just another victim. He was the man who had pulled dozens of climbers from these very slopes, who knew every trail and crevice better than his own reflection. The irony wasn't lost on her, even through her rising panic. She nudged his shoulder with increasing urgency, but he remained motionless except for those frighteningly weak breaths. The avalanche had swept them nearly 200 feet down the slope, far from any marked trail. Even if the weather cleared, which seemed unlikely, no one would think to look for them here. Marcus always filed detailed route plans, and this deviation would never have been in his paperwork. The cold bit through her thick winter coat, and she could feel ice crystals forming around her nostrils. If she was struggling, Marcus wouldn't last another hour in his current state. His heavy rescue gear, usually an advantage, now worked against him as the metal buckles and clips conducted the brutal cold directly to his body. Petra had been Marcus's partner for 8 years, longer than any donkey had served in the mountain rescue service. She'd carried injured climbers down treacherous paths, hauled emergency supplies up impossible grades, and once even served as an anchor point when Marcus rappelled into a crevasse to extract a fallen hiker. But this was different. This time, she was alone with the responsibility. She began to pace in tight circles around Marcus, her hooves finding surprising purchase on the icy ground. Each step seemed to come easier than the last, as if the mountain itself was steadying her movements. The sensation puzzled her. She'd walked these slopes countless times, but never had they felt so responsive to her presence. As she moved, something strange began to happen. The snow around Marcus stopped accumulating quite so quickly. The wind, while still fierce, seemed to curve around their small depression rather than driving straight through it. Petra paused, testing the phenomenon by stepping away from Marcus. Immediately, the full force of the blizzard returned, snow pelting his still form with renewed vengeance. She hurried back to his side, resuming her circular patrol. Again, the elements seemed to ease their assault. It made no scientific sense, but Petra had lived long enough in these mountains to know that they held mysteries beyond human understanding. Marcus himself had told her stories passed down through generations of guides, tales of animals that could predict avalanches days in advance, of paths that appeared and disappeared according to their own logic, of storms that respected certain ancient boundaries. The stories suddenly felt less like folklore and more like instruction manuals. Petra closed her eyes and tried to feel what was happening around her. The sensation was subtle at first, like a humming just below the threshold of hearing, but as she concentrated, it grew stronger. She could sense the flow of the wind, the weight of the snow-laden clouds above, even the deep geological pulse of the mountain itself. It was as if she'd suddenly developed a new sense, one that connected her directly to the living system of stone and ice and air that surrounded them. Working on instinct, she began to adjust her movements, stepping in patterns that felt right rather than logical. With each circuit, the protective effect grew stronger. The snow began to swirl away from Marcus entirely, creating a small pocket of relative calm in the chaos of the storm. But shelter alone wouldn't be enough. His body temperature was still dropping, and the nearest rescue station was miles away through impossible terrain. Even if she could somehow guide a rescue team to their location, Marcus would be dead long before they arrived. She needed to get him moving, to generate heat in his body before it was too late. But how could a donkey perform CPR or administer first aid? Her hooves were poor substitutes for human hands, and she lacked the knowledge of pressure points and circulation that Marcus had drilled into every member of his rescue teams. As if responding to her desperate need, new information began to flow into her consciousness. Not thoughts exactly, but understanding. Knowledge of how warmth moved through living bodies, of pressure points that could stimulate circulation, of breathing rhythms that could coax life back into failing systems. The information felt ancient, as if it had been waiting in the mountain's memory for exactly this moment. Petra approached Marcus with newfound purpose. She began to work methodically, using her muzzle and the flat of her hooves to apply pressure at specific points along his torso and limbs. The technique felt familiar despite being impossible. She'd never learned anything like this, yet somehow her body knew exactly what to do. The wind shrieked like a banshee across the mountainside, driving snow so thick that Bjorn could barely see his own mittened hands. Each breath burned his lungs with crystalline fire, and his legs felt like lead weights dragging through the deepening drifts. Behind him, Astrid's steady hoofbeats had become his lifeline, the rhythmic crunch, 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 the only sound that cut through the storm's fury. "Almost there, girl," he wheezed, though he wasn't certain of anything anymore. The familiar landmarks had vanished beneath nature's white fury, and even his seasoned mountain sense seemed dulled by exhaustion. 40 years of rescues, 40 years of reading these peaks like a favorite book, and now the pages had all been torn away. Astrid's warm breath touched his shoulder, a gentle nudge that said keep going. She had never failed him, not in a decade of partnership. While other rescuers relied on helicopters that couldn't fly in weather like this, or snowmobiles that broke down when you needed them most, Astrid simply endured. She was mountain-born, as sturdy and reliable as the granite peaks themselves. The radio crackled against his chest, broken voices fighting through static. Base 2, on, respond. Missing climbers, coordinates. The words fractured like ice, meaningless fragments swallowed by the storm. He tried to respond, but his numb fingers couldn't work the controls. The cold had seeped through every layer, turning his body into something foreign and unresponsive. A sudden gust nearly knocked him sideways, and Bjorn stumbled, his knees hitting the snow hard. The world tilted dangerously, white and grey bleeding together in a nauseating swirl. His heart hammered against his ribs with an irregular rhythm that sent spikes of panic through his chest. Not now. Not when people were depending on him. He struggled to his feet, but his left leg buckled immediately. Astrid was there instantly, her solid flank pressed against him, offering support. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that had always unsettled strangers, too knowing, too deep for an animal. But Bjorn had learned to trust that intelligence completely. "The Eriksson boys," he gasped, using her neck to pull himself upright. "They're up there somewhere. 17 and 19, barely more than children." The rescue call had come in just as the storm hit. 2 brothers caught in the avalanche zone above Troll's Tooth Ridge. Every minute of delay decreased their chances of survival exponentially. Another step forward, then another. His vision blurred at the edges, dark spots dancing like crows across the white landscape. The pain in his chest had spread down his left arm, a crushing weight that made each breath a monumental effort. He'd felt this before, years ago, after his first heart attack. The doctors had told him to retire then, to leave the mountains to younger men. But the mountains had called him back, as they always did. Astrid's ears swiveled forward suddenly, alert. Through the storm's chaos, she had heard something. A sound too faint for human ears. Her nostrils flared, scenting the air with an ancient wisdom that GPS and modern equipment could never match. She knew these peaks in ways that went beyond mere familiarity. "What is it, girl?" Bjorn followed her gaze up the slope, where the snow seemed to glow with its own inner light. It was probably just his oxygen-starved brain playing tricks, but for a moment he could have sworn he saw shapes moving through the blizzard. tall figures with flowing hair and eyes like stars. The mountain folklore flooded back unbidden. His grandmother's stories of the Huldufolk, the hidden people who watched over travelers in the wild places. The old woman had insisted that some animals, especially those born during the aurora borealis, carried a spark of that ancient magic. Astrid had been born on just such a night, under sheets of green fire that painted the entire sky. Nonsense, of course, pretty tales for children and tourists, but as his strength failed and the world grew distant, Bjorn found himself hoping those old stories might hold a grain of truth. His legs gave out completely this time, and he collapsed face first into the snow. The cold bit through his jacket like a living thing, eager to claim another victim. His radio fell silent. The mountain had become a tomb of white silence, broken only by the wind's mournful song. Astrid's muzzle touched his cheek, warm and soft. When he managed to lift his head, her eyes seemed different somehow, older, filled with a light that had nothing to do with reflected snow. She looked up the mountain, toward the trapped climbers, then back at him, her expression almost human in its concern and determination. Can't make it," he whispered. "Call for help, somehow." The donkey stood perfectly still for a long moment, as if listening to voices only she could hear. Then something shifted in the air around them, subtle as a change in pressure before a storm. The snow began to swirl in patterns that defied the wind. The storm's fury had reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. Wind shrieked through the ravines like the voices of the damned, and snow fell so thick it formed a white curtain between Magdalena and the world she had known. But something inside her had changed during those moments when she'd felt the mountain's ancient heartbeat. The panic that had threatened to overwhelm her had crystallized into something harder, more focused. She pressed her nose against Jakob's neck, feeling for the pulse that had grown so weak she could barely detect it. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a small miracle that might be the last. The cave offered shelter from the wind, but the cold was seeping through the stone walls like a living thing, reaching for them with icy fingers. The strange warmth in her chest pulsed again, stronger this time. It spread down through her legs and up into her ears, which twitched forward as sounds she'd never noticed before began to filter through the storm's roar. Somewhere far below, she could hear the whisper of wind through a different kind of space, not the tight confines of their cave, but something vast and echoing. A larger cavern, perhaps, or even a passage that might lead them to safety. But Jakob couldn't walk, could barely breathe, and she was just a donkey. The thought sparked something rebellious in her mind. Just a donkey. How many times had she heard those words, or felt their weight in the dismissive glances of tourists who saw only a beast of burden? Yet she had navigated paths that would terrify experienced climbers. She had carried loads that would break the backs of lesser animals. She had stood steady on ledges where one wrong step meant death, because Jacob needed her to be steady. Jacob had never seen her as just anything from the first day he'd rescued her from the slaughterhouse. A half-starved yearling with rope burns on her neck, he had spoken to her as if she understood every word. And perhaps she had. Perhaps she'd always been more than what others believed possible. The warmth in her chest pulsed brighter, and suddenly she could see the cave as if lit by summer sunlight. Every crack in the stone wall stood out in sharp relief, and she noticed something she'd missed before, a narrow opening near the back wall, partially hidden by a fallen boulder. Air moved through that gap, carrying scents from somewhere deeper in the mountain's heart. She stood carefully, trying not to disturb Jakob's position, and made her way to the opening. The space was tight, barely wide enough for her shoulders, but the air flowing through it was noticeably warmer. She pushed her head through the gap and found herself looking down a natural tunnel that sloped gently downward. Somewhere far ahead, she caught the faintest glimmer of what might be reflected light. But getting Jacob through that opening would be impossible while he remained unconscious. Even if she could drag him, and she wasn't certain she could, the rough stone would tear his already battered body apart. She returned to his side and lowered her head until her breath warmed his face. "Jacob," she whispered. though the sound that emerged was still the soft bray of a donkey. Yet somehow she felt certain he would understand the urgency behind it. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. His lips had taken on a blue tinge that made her heart race with fear. Time was running out, and traditional methods weren't going to save him. The ancient presence she'd felt earlier seemed to stir again, not from outside this time, but from somewhere deep within her own being. It rose like water from a hidden spring, bringing with it a knowledge that felt both foreign and utterly familiar. She understood, with a certainty that bypassed rational thought, that the mountains had always harbored more than rock and ice. There were older forces here, predating human memory, and some of those forces had been watching the daily heroism of one man and his faithful companion with growing interest. The warmth in her chest blazed suddenly, spreading through her entire body until she felt as if she were glowing from within. And perhaps she was. The cave around her seemed brighter now, though she cast no shadow on the walls. The sensation was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once, like being struck by lightning and discovering that instead of destroying you, it had awakened something magnificent. She placed her muzzle against Jakob's forehead and felt the ancient power flow between them. His breathing deepened slightly, and color began to return to his lips. Not enough to wake him, but enough to buy them precious time. Now she had to decide, stay here and hope the storm passed before Jakob's strength failed completely, or trust in this newfound power and attempt the treacherous journey through unknown passages toward what might be salvation, or a swifter death. The mountain held its breath, waiting for her choice. The wind had become a living thing, clawing at Stellan's face with icy talons as consciousness flickered back to him in fragments. His body felt disconnected, as if he were watching someone else's limbs refuse to respond properly. The cold had crept so deep into his bones that he could barely distinguish between his flesh and the frozen ground beneath him. Bella stood over him, her warm breath creating small clouds that dissipated instantly in the howling gale. Her dark eyes held an intensity he had never seen before, almost human in their determination. She nudged him again with her muzzle, more insistently this time, and he managed to raise one trembling hand to touch her neck. "Good girl," he whispered, the words barely audible above the storm's roar. "Smart girl." But even as he spoke, Stellan knew they were both going to die here. His experience told him what his failing body already understood. He was deep into hypothermia, past the point where willpower alone could save him. The irony wasn't lost on him that after 4 decades of pulling others from winter's grasp, the mountains would claim him in the end. Bella stepped back and began to pace in tight circles around him, her hooves crunching through the snow with purposeful rhythm. At first, Stellan thought she was simply agitated, responding to his distress the way animals do when they sense death approaching. But there was something different about her movement, something deliberate that cut through his confusion. The donkey's pacing grew more focused, her steps tracing what seemed like a pattern in the snow. Round and round she went, and with each circuit, Stellan felt something shift in the air around them. The wind still howled, but its bite seemed less savage. The snow continued to fall, but somehow it wasn't accumulating as heavily in the space where she walked. Through his fading vision, Stellan watched in amazement as Bella's hoofprints began to glow with a faint amber light. Not reflected light, there was nothing to reflect in this whiteout, but light that seemed to emanate from the packed snow itself. Each step left a luminous mark that pulsed gently, like embers refusing to die. "What?" He tried to speak, but found his voice trapped in his throat. Bella completed another circle, and this time the glow intensified. The pattern of her hoofprints formed an unbroken ring around Stellan's prone form, and within that circle he felt the temperature begin to rise. Not dramatically, but enough that his violent shivering started to subside. The wind still raged beyond the perimeter Bella had created, but inside an impossible calm descended. Old Matteo's words echoed in his memory. "That donkey. She's special, Stellan. More special than you know." Bella stopped her pacing and approached him again, lowering her head until her forehead touched his. The moment their skin made contact, warmth flooded through Stellan's body like hot wine in his veins, not the false warmth of dying hypothermia, but true, life-giving heat that pushed back against the cold's invasion. Images flashed through his mind, not his own memories, but something older, deeper. He saw these mountains as they had been centuries ago, when the peaks were revered as sacred places and the animals that dwelt upon them were understood to be more than mere beasts. He saw donkeys like Bella, their eyes bright with ancient wisdom, serving as guardians and guides for travelers who ventured into the high places. The rescue missions came next, dozens of them, but seen now from Bella's perspective. Every time Stellan had thought his skill and experience had located a buried climber or guided them safely through a whiteout, she had been there, subtly steering him toward the right path, somehow sensing life beneath avalanche debris, using abilities that had no name in the modern world. She had been saving lives through him for years, and he had never known. The warmth continued to flow between them, and Stellan felt his strength slowly returning. The deadly lethargy that had been dragging him toward unconsciousness lifted, replaced by a growing sense of vitality. Around them, the glowing circle in the snow pulsed brighter, creating a sanctuary of warmth and calm in the heart of the storm. "How?" he whispered against Bella's neck, but she only snorted softly in response. Through the swirling snow beyond their protective circle, shapes began to move. At first, Stellan thought they were hallucinations brought on by hypothermia and shock. But as his vision cleared, he realized he was seeing other animals. Mountain goats with eyes that glowed like stars, an eagle that flew impossibly steady through the gale, even what looked like a wolf watching from a distant ridge. They were gathering, drawn by whatever force Bella had awakened. The old guardians of the mountains, responding to a call that reached back to the earliest days when the boundary between the natural and supernatural was thin as morning mist. Bella raised her head and looked directly into the storm, her ears pricked forward with determination. The real rescue, Stellan realized, was just beginning. The wind howled through the peaks like a living thing, its voice carrying whispers that seemed to emanate from the mountain's very bones. Greta pressed forward through the deepening snow, her breath forming crystalline clouds that disappeared instantly into the white void. Each step required tremendous effort as the drifts reached nearly to her belly, but something beyond mere determination drove her now. The strange warmth that had begun in her chest continued to spread, flowing through her limbs like liquid starlight. With it came sensations she had never experienced, a heightened awareness that made every sound, every shift in the wind's direction, every subtle change in the snow's texture feel magnified and meaningful. The blizzard no longer seemed like an enemy to battle, but rather a force to navigate, its patterns suddenly readable in ways that defied explanation. Behind her, secured to the makeshift travois with climbing rope, Thomas remained unconscious. His breathing had grown more labored, each exhale a visible puff that grew fainter with each passing minute. The improvised stretcher, constructed from broken skis and his torn jacket, carved a deep furrow in the snow as Greta hauled it forward. Her muscles screamed in protest, but the mysterious energy coursing through her seemed to mute the pain, replacing it with an otherworldly endurance. The path ahead remained treacherous. What had been a familiar trail during countless previous rescues now lay buried beneath several feet of fresh powder. Landmarks that Thomas had taught her to recognize, the distinctive boulder shaped like a crouching bear, the ancient pine twisted into an arch by decades of wind, had vanished into the white anonymity of the storm. Yet somehow, Greta found herself choosing the correct route at each junction, her hooves finding purchase on hidden rocks, her instincts guiding her away from the concealed crevasses that could swallow them both. The whispers in the wind grew stronger, more distinct. Though she could not understand their words, their meaning seemed to flow directly into her consciousness. They spoke of old paths, of times when the boundary between the animal and spirit worlds grew thin during the fiercest storms. They told of ancient compacts between the mountain and those who served it faithfully, bonds that transcended species and spanned generations. As if responding to these ethereal voices, Greta's vision began to change. The uniform white of the blizzard took on subtle variations, pale blue shadows that marked safe passage, darker patches that warned of unstable snow, and thin silver lines that seemed to trace the safest route down the mountainside. She followed these luminous guides without question, trusting in whatever force had awakened within her. The descent grew steeper, and the travois threatened to overrun her on the slick surface. Greta adjusted her stance, digging her hooves deep into the snow and leaning back against the weight. The rope cut into her shoulders, but she pressed on, driven by an urgency that seemed to emanate from Thomas himself. She could sense his life force weakening, feel the hypothermia claiming more of him with each passing moment. Through the swirling snow, a flicker of orange light appeared far below. The ranger station, still miles away but finally visible through a brief gap in the storm. Hope flared in Greta's chest, mixing with the strange power that continued to sustain her. She had descended farther than seemed possible in such conditions, making progress that would have challenged even Thomas at his strongest. The whispers shifted, becoming more urgent, more insistent. They spoke now of sacrifice, of prices paid and debts honored. Greta understood, with a clarity that transcended language, that the power flowing through her came with a cost. The mountain spirits who aided her now demanded something in return, though what that might be remained unclear. A sudden crack echoed through the air, sharp and ominous above the wind's constant roar. The snow beneath Greta's feet shifted, and she felt the ground give way slightly. An avalanche zone, made unstable by the weight of fresh snow and her passage. She froze, every instinct screaming danger, but the ethereal guidance urged her forward. The silver path in her enhanced vision led directly across the unstable slope, the only route that would get Thomas to safety in time. Greta took a deep breath and stepped onto the treacherous surface. The snow held, though she could feel its precarious balance beneath her hooves. Step by careful step, she crossed the danger zone, the travois sliding smoothly behind her. Halfway across, she heard another crack, louder this time, and felt the entire slope shudder. The whispers rose to an urgent chorus, no longer guiding but pleading, as if the very mountain held its breath. With a final desperate surge, Greta lunged forward, pulling Thomas clear of the avalanche zone just as the slope gave way behind them. Tons of snow thundered down the mountainside, burying the path they had just traveled. There would be no going back now, only forward toward the distant light that promised salvation for the man who had devoted his life to saving others. The wind screamed across the mountainside with renewed fury, as if sensing Petra's desperate flight toward the monastery. Each step through the deepening snow sent jolts of ancient power coursing through her legs, the strange energy that had awakened within her burning brighter with every passing moment. Behind her, wrapped in the makeshift travois she had fashioned from broken branches and rope, Marcus lay unconscious, his breathing so shallow it barely misted in the frigid air. The monastery's bell tower emerged from the swirling snow like a phantom, its stone walls dark against the white tempest. Petra's heart hammered as she recognized the ancient structure. She had passed it countless times during rescues with Marcus, but never had she approached it alone, never with such desperate purpose. The building seemed impossibly distant, yet something deep in her bones urged her forward with unwavering certainty. Brother Thomas was tending the evening fire when the massive wooden doors shuddered under heavy impacts. The sound was too rhythmic to be the wind, too purposeful. He set down his prayer book and moved cautiously toward the entrance, his sandaled feet silent on the worn stone floor. Another series of thunderous knocks echoed through the halls, and he could swear he heard something like whimpering between the strikes. When he lifted the heavy iron latch and pulled open the door, the sight that greeted him defied all reason. A grey donkey stood in the doorway, her coat matted with ice, her dark eyes blazing with an intelligence that made the monk step backward in wonder. Behind her, a crude sledge bore the motionless form of a man wrapped in blankets. "Sweet merciful Lord," Thomas breathed, recognizing the weathered face despite its blue-tinged pallor. "Marcus Valdez." Petra pushed past the stunned monk, dragging her burden into the warmth of the monastery's main hall. The sudden transition from the howling wind to blessed silence was overwhelming, but she could not rest. Every instinct screamed that time was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. She positioned herself beside Marcus and began nudging him with her muzzle, her breath coming in sharp puffs. Brother Thomas knelt beside the unconscious rescuer, his practiced hands checking for signs of life. His pulses weak, body temperature dangerously low. "How did you manage this journey, little one?" He looked into Petra's eyes and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. There was something ancient there, something that predated the monastery, predated perhaps even the mountains themselves. More monks appeared, drawn by the commotion. Brother Francis, their healer, took charge immediately, barking orders for hot water, blankets, and medicinal herbs. But as they worked to warm Marcus's lifeless limbs, Petra grew increasingly agitated. She could feel something crucial slipping away, could sense that conventional healing would not be enough. The power that had sustained her through the blizzard now pulsed with new urgency. Without fully understanding what she was doing, Petra placed her head against Marcus's chest, directly over his heart. The monks paused in their ministrations, startled by her deliberate action. "What is she doing?" whispered Brother Paul. Brother Thomas found himself unable to speak as he watched an extraordinary transformation begin. A soft, golden light emanated from where Petra's forehead touched Marcus's chest, growing brighter until it illuminated the entire hall. The light seemed to flow into Marcus's body, spreading through his limbs like warm honey, chasing away the deadly cold that had settled into his bones. Petra felt the ancient power flowing out of her, centuries of accumulated magic drawn from the mountain itself. She understood now why her kind had always been chosen as companions for those who ventured into the high places. They were conduits, bridges between the mortal world and the eternal strength of stone and sky. The knowledge came not as thought, but as instinct, as natural as breathing. Marcus's fingers twitched, his eyelids fluttered. Color began to return to his cheeks as the supernatural warmth drove out the killing frost. His breathing deepened, steadied, became strong enough to fog the air with each exhalation. The golden light gradually faded, leaving Petra swaying on her feet, exhausted but triumphant. She had given nearly everything she had, but it was enough. Marcus would live. Brother Thomas reached out with trembling hands to touch Petra's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath her damp fur. "What manner of creature are you?" he whispered. As if in answer, Marcus's eyes opened. He looked up at the vaulted ceiling of the monastery, confusion clouding his features until his gaze found Petra standing beside him. Recognition dawned, followed immediately by wonder. "Petra," he whispered, his voice hoarse but strong. "How did we—" He tried to sit up, memory returning in fragments. The storm, the collapse, the overwhelming certainty that he would never see another dawn. "Your donkey brought you here through the worst blizzard in a generation," Brother Thomas explained, his voice filled with awe. "She saved your life, Marcus. She saved you both." The wind's howling had become a constant companion, but beneath its fury, Kyle heard something else, a low, rhythmic sound that didn't belong to the storm. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion and cold, struggled to focus through the swirling snow. The makeshift shelter of rocks and his torn jacket provided little protection, but it had kept him alive through the worst of the night. There it was again, a steady crunching, like hoofbeats in deep snow. "Naya?" His voice came out as barely a whisper, his throat raw from the cold air he'd been breathing. It couldn't be. He'd sent her down the mountain, watched her disappear into the white void hours ago. The donkey was smart, but not smart enough to find him in this chaos. The sound grew closer, and through the wall of snow, a dark shape emerged. Kyle blinked hard, certain he was hallucinating. But the familiar silhouette of his companion materialized from the storm, her head lowered against the wind, ice crystals coating her thick winter coat. She carried something in her mouth, a bundle wrapped in what looked like his emergency bivouac sack. How had she even known to? Naya dropped the bundle at his feet and immediately pressed her warm body against his side. The heat radiating from her was impossible, as if she'd been standing next to a fire instead of trudging through a mountain blizzard. Kyle's numb fingers fumbled with the bivouac sack, and inside he found his thermal sleeping bag, dry clothes, and his emergency stove with fuel canisters. How did you? He stopped himself. Questions could wait. Survival came first, just as he'd taught countless others over the decades. With Naya's body blocking the worst of the wind, he managed to light the small stove and change into the dry clothes. The warmth was like a resurrection. But as feeling returned to his extremities, so did the throbbing pain in his chest. The heart attack hadn't been severe, but his body was still recovering, still fragile. He needed to get off the mountain, and soon. Naya nudged him with her nose, then stepped back and looked directly into his eyes. In 40 years of partnership, he'd never seen her gaze hold such intensity, such deliberate communication. She walked a few steps away, then returned, repeating the motion. "You want me to follow you?" It wasn't a question. "But girl, I don't know if I can make it down in this weather. The visibility is—" She interrupted him with a soft whicker, the same sound she'd made years ago when she'd first led him to those trapped climbers. The same sound that had preceded every impossible rescue they'd accomplished together. But this time, there was something different about it, something that seemed to resonate in his bones. Kyle struggled to his feet, packing the essential gear into his backpack. Each movement was an effort, but Naya waited patiently, occasionally pressing against him when his balance wavered. As they began their descent, he realized she wasn't following any of the established trails. Instead, she was cutting across terrain he'd never attempted before, finding paths through the rocks that seemed to appear just as they needed them. The storm should have made navigation impossible, but Naya moved with absolute certainty. More disturbing still, the snow seemed to part slightly around her, creating a pocket of calmer air that Kyle could walk in. He told himself it was coincidence, some trick of the mountain's topography, but the rational explanation felt hollow. They descended for what felt like hours, though time had lost meaning in the white chaos. Kyle's strength was fading again when Naya suddenly stopped and turned toward what looked like solid rock face. She approached the stone and pushed against it with her shoulder, and impossibly a section swung inward, revealing a cave entrance. The space inside was larger than it had appeared from outside, and most shocking of all, it was warm. Not just sheltered from wind, warm, but genuinely heated, as if by some internal source. Ancient symbols were carved into the walls, worn smooth by time but still visible in the strange, sourceless light that filled the cavern. Naya walked to the center of the cave and lay down, patting the ground beside her with one hoof. Kyle sank gratefully onto the surprisingly soft stone floor, his back against his donkey's side. The warmth seeped into his aching muscles and bones. "What is this place?" he whispered, running his fingers over the carved symbols nearest to him. They seemed familiar somehow, like half-remembered dreams. Naya's breathing had become deep and regular, but Kyle could swear he felt something more than just her physical presence. It was as if the cave itself was alive, pulsing gently with some ancient rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. Whatever this place was, wherever these powers Naya had shown were coming from, he was beyond questioning them. For now he was safe, and that was miracle enough. The ancient magic coursed through Pasha's veins like liquid starlight, each heartbeat sending waves of power rippling beneath his coarse grey coat. His hooves, once ordinary and worn from decades of mountain paths, now gleamed with an ethereal blue light that cut through the howling darkness of the blizzard. The transformation had awakened something deep within his consciousness, memories that weren't his own yet felt as familiar as his master's gentle voice. He moved with purpose now, each step deliberate and sure despite the knee-deep snow that would have slowed him to a crawl mere hours ago. The wind that had been his enemy now seemed to part before him, as if recognizing something ancient and worthy of respect. Behind him, Jakob's unconscious form lay secured in the makeshift sled, wrapped in every piece of fabric and gear Pasha could gather from their scattered supplies. The donkey's enhanced senses picked up traces of warmth in the distance, not the false promise of hypothermia-induced hallucinations, but real shelter. A hunter's cabin, perhaps, or an emergency refuge built by the Mountain Rescue Service years ago. His nostrils flared, sorting through the chaotic symphony of scents that the magic now allowed him to perceive with startling clarity. But something else rode on the wind, the acrid smell of fear, the metallic tang of blood, and the unmistakable musk of predators emboldened by the storm. A pack of wolves, driven down from the higher peaks by the savage weather, had caught the scent of weakness. They were closing in, their pale forms ghosting through the snow like harbingers of death. Pasha's ears swiveled backward, catching the first faint howl that pierced the storm's roar. His ancient memories stirred, showing him flashes of a time when his kind had been more than beasts of burden, when they had been guardians, protectors blessed by mountain spirits to defend those who could not defend themselves. The knowledge of what he could do flowed through him like a river breaking through winter ice. The first wolf appeared as a shadow against the white, yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. It padded closer, testing this strange creature that glowed with otherworldly light. Pasha didn't break stride, but his awareness expanded, tracking the positions of the entire pack as they began to encircle him and his helpless cargo. The Alpha struck first, launching itself through the air with deadly grace. But Pasha was no longer the simple donkey who had carried supplies up mountain paths for 40 years. He pivoted on his hindquarters, his front hooves rising to meet the attack. When they connected with the wolf's chest, blue fire erupted from the contact point, sending the predator tumbling backward with a yelp of pain and confusion. The pack hesitated, but hunger and desperation drove them forward. They came from all sides, a coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed any normal animal. Pasha's response was swift and terrible. The light emanating from his body intensified, casting dancing shadows on the snow as he fought with the fury of avalanches and the precision of falling ice. Each kick of his hooves sent ripples of blue energy crackling through the air. The wolves that were struck found themselves thrown backward by forces beyond their comprehension, their fur singed by cold fire that burned without consuming. This was not the brutal violence of fang and claw, but something older and more primal, the mountain itself defending its children. The battle was brief, but decisive. The surviving wolves retreated into the storm, their tails tucked and their prideful howls reduced to whimpers of defeat. They had encountered something beyond their understanding, a power that spoke of ancient pacts between the wild places and those who served them faithfully. Pasha stood among the churned snow, his sides heaving with exertion. The magical energy still pulsed through him, but he could feel its finite nature. This power was not meant to be sustained indefinitely. It was a gift to be used wisely, a final blessing for one who had earned it through decades of unwavering loyalty. He looked back at Jakob, checking to ensure his master had not been disturbed during the fight. The old man's breathing remained shallow but steady, his face pale as mountain snow but still holding the stubborn set of jaw that had carried him through 40 years of impossible rescues. The scent of shelter grew stronger now, carried on wind currents that seemed to bend toward their destination. Pasha leaned into the harness again, his luminous hooves finding purchase on ice that should have been treacherous. The sled glided behind him as if weightless, its runners cutting clean furrows through the storm drift. Above them, the blizzard continued its relentless assault on the mountain, but something had changed in the fundamental balance of the night. Where once there had been only death stalking through the darkness, now there was hope, pulled by 4 legs and powered by love deeper than winter, stronger than stone, and more enduring than the peaks themselves. The ancient stone beneath Petra's hooves pulsed with a rhythm that matched her thundering heart. Each step forward sent vibrations through the crystalline formations embedded in the cave walls, and she could feel the mountain itself awakening around her. The whispers had grown stronger since she'd entered this sacred space. No longer fragments of sound, but clear voices speaking in a language older than human memory. The bloodline calls. The compact must be honored. Behind her, Magnus lay unconscious on the makeshift travois, his breathing so shallow it barely fogged in the frigid air. She had dragged him deeper into the mountain's heart, following an instinct that pulled her forward like an invisible rope. The storm still raged outside, but here in these ancient chambers, a different kind of power stirred. The passage opened into a vast circular chamber carved from living rock. In its center stood a pool of water so still it might have been black glass, reflecting the pale blue light that emanated from veins of mineral threading through the stone. Around the pool's edge, carved figures emerged from the rock itself, donkeys and mules, their stone eyes seeming to track Petra's movement as she entered. 40 winters he has climbed, 40 winters he has saved the lost. The debt grows heavy. Petra approached the pool cautiously, her hooves clicking against symbols etched into the floor. The carvings told a story she somehow understood without learning, an ancient pact between the mountain and those who served as its guardians. For generations beyond counting, the beasts of burden had carried more than supplies and travelers. They had carried the mountain's blessing, its power to preserve life in the killing cold. But the power came with a price. She turned back to Magnus, studying his face in the ethereal light. Even unconscious, pain creased his features. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and dark stains had seeped through his coat where jagged rocks had torn at him during their fall. Without help, he would die here. The mountain had claimed so many others. Why should it spare him? Because he has never taken a life the mountain offered freely. Because he has given his own strength to preserve others. Because his heart beats in rhythm with ours. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the stone and through Petra's bones. She understood now why she had been drawn to this place, why her grandmother's stories had filled her dreams during the long winter nights. The mountain remembered its own, and Magnus, whether he knew it or not, had become one of its chosen guardians. But guardians needed strength, and strength required sacrifice. Petra stepped to the pool's edge and saw her reflection wavering in the dark water. For a moment, another image superimposed itself over hers, a larger donkey with the same determined eyes, standing in this very spot decades ago when Magnus was just a young man starting his first season as a rescuer. Her grandmother making the choice that would bind their bloodline to the mountain's service. The gift passes to you now. Will you accept what was freely given? She looked again at Magnus, remembering every rescue they had shared, every life they had pulled back from the mountain's cold embrace. The families reunited, the tears of relief, the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. This man had never asked for glory or recognition. He simply climbed when others needed saving, again and again, until his body began to fail and his legend grew beyond his understanding. Petra lowered her muzzle to the pool's surface. The water was impossibly warm against her lips, tasting of minerals and something else, something that sparked along her tongue like captured lightning. As she drank, the blue light in the chamber intensified, and she felt the mountain's power flowing into her, changing her, preparing her for what lay ahead. The transformation was not painful, but it was profound. Her muscles strengthened, her lungs expanded to process the thin mountain air more efficiently, her hooves grew harder and sure. Most importantly, she could sense the mountain's moods and intentions as clearly as she read the weather. She would never be lost in these peaks again, would never fail to find the safest path through any storm. But with the gift came understanding of its cost. No guardian served forever. The mountain would claim its due when her time came, just as it had claimed her grandmother's strength in the end. The power she had gained would sustain her through years of service, but those years would burn more brightly and briefly than an ordinary life. Magnus stirred behind her, a soft groan escaping his lips. Petra turned from the pool, her reflection now showing eyes that held flecks of the same blue light that danced through the chamber walls. She moved to his side and gently nuzzled his face, sharing some small measure of the warmth that now flowed through her veins. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, but alive. "Now we climb," the voices whispered. "Now we serve." The ancient power coursed through Alma's veins like liquid starlight, transforming her perception of the world around her. The blizzard that had seemed so overwhelming moments before now appeared as merely another obstacle to navigate. She could sense the mountain's heartbeat beneath layers of snow and ice, feel the pulse of every living creature sheltering within its embrace. Stefan's breathing had grown more labored, each exhale creating smaller clouds of vapor in the frigid air. His face had taken on an alarming grayish pallor that even the dim emergency light couldn't disguise. Alma pressed her warm muzzle against his cheek, willing some of her newfound energy into his failing body. She felt a spark pass between them, and his eyes fluttered open briefly. "Girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind, "you need to get yourself to safety." But Alma understood now that safety wasn't something she needed to seek. It was something she could create. The knowledge flowing through her consciousness included not just the geography of every trail and crevice, but also the secret paths that connected this mountain to others, routes that existed between the physical and spiritual realms. She stepped back from Stefan and closed her eyes, reaching out with senses she hadn't known she possessed. There, 3 miles northeast, barely perceptible through the storm, she detected the warmth of multiple human bodies. A rescue team, she realized, but they were moving in the wrong direction, following the standard search patterns that would take them away from this hidden alcove. The wind howled with renewed fury, as if the mountain itself was testing her resolve. Alma planted her hooves firmly and drew upon the power that now felt as natural as breathing. She lifted her head and released a sound unlike any she had ever made before. Part bray, part song, part primal call that seemed to echo not just across the physical landscape, but through dimensions beyond mortal understanding. The sound traveled on currents of wind and will, seeking the rescue team with purposeful intent. She felt it find them, saw through eyes not her own, as several searchers stopped mid-stride, their heads turning toward her location, despite the impossibility of hearing anything over the storm. But calling them wasn't enough. Stefan's condition was deteriorating too rapidly for a conventional rescue. She needed to do something more immediate, more direct. Alma turned her attention inward, exploring the vast reservoir of knowledge now at her disposal. Among the memories of countless generations of mountain guardians, she found what she sought, the technique of life-sharing, a practice so ancient and dangerous that only the most desperate circumstances could justify its use. The process required absolute trust and perfect synchronization between guardian and protected. Alma positioned herself carefully beside Stefan's prone form and began to regulate her breathing, slowing her heart rate until it matched his weakening pulse. Then, gradually, she began to share her life force with him, allowing her own vitality to flow through the connection they had forged over decades of partnership. Through their shared consciousness, Stefan experienced flashes of her transformed perception. He saw the rescue team adjusting their search pattern in response to her mystical call, felt the mountain's ancient presence acknowledging their plight, understood for the first time the true nature of his faithful companion's heritage. "Alma," he breathed, his voice stronger now but filled with concern as he realized what she was sacrificing. "You're giving too much." She nudged him gently, communicating without words that this was her choice, her purpose. The Guardian bloodline had waited centuries for a moment like this, when their ancient duty could be fulfilled not through violence or dominance, but through pure, selfless love. The sound of voices grew closer, and soon the beam of powerful flashlights cut through the darkness of their shelter. The rescue team had found them with impossible accuracy, guided by forces they would never fully understand. As trained hands began assessing Stefan's condition and preparing him for transport, Alma allowed herself to step back, her legs trembling from the effort of the life-sharing ritual. Stefan reached out and grasped her halter as the rescuers worked around them, his eyes meeting hers with profound understanding. In that moment, he saw her not as a simple mountain donkey, but as the ancient guardian she had always been, the protector who had chosen to spend her immortal existence in humble service to those who needed her most. The storm was beginning to weaken, its fury spent against the immovable will of love and sacrifice. As the rescue team prepared to move Stefan down the mountain, Alma felt the ancient power settling into a steady, sustainable flow within her consciousness. She had awakened to her true nature, and there would be no going back to the simple existence she had known before. The ancient energy coursed through Baya's hooves like liquid starlight, each step leaving crystalline prints that glowed briefly before fading into the snow. She could feel the mountain's consciousness awakening around her, every stone, every buried root, every sleeping creature stirring at her passage. The blizzard still raged, but now it seemed to part before her like curtains drawn aside by invisible hands. Magnus lay unconscious across her back, his breathing shallow but steady. The mystical warmth emanating from her coat had stabilized him, but she knew time was still their enemy. The village was hours away through normal travel, and the storm showed no signs of abating. She needed something more than just the ancient power flowing through her veins. She needed allies. As if summoned by her thoughts, a massive shape emerged from the swirling snow ahead. A mountain ram, his curved horns frosted with ice, stood blocking their path. His eyes held the same ethereal glow that now burned within Baya's own, and she understood immediately. The mountain's guardians were awakening. The ram dipped his great head in acknowledgement, then turned and began forging a path through a drift that would have been impassable moments before. His powerful legs churned through snow that seemed to part and solidify beneath his hooves, creating a stable trail for Baya to follow. Soon others joined them. A family of mountain goats appeared from ledges that should have been invisible in the storm, their sure feet finding purchase on ice-slicked rocks as they bounded alongside the growing procession. An enormous golden eagle materialized from the white chaos above, its wings barely moving as it rode currents that defied the blizzard's fury. Even the wind itself seemed to shift, no longer fighting their progress, but flowing around them like a protective embrace. Baya felt Magnus stir slightly and heard him mumble something incoherent. Through their decades of partnership, she had learned to read his every gesture, every sound. He was fighting to stay conscious, his rescuer's instincts even now trying to assess their situation. She nickered softly, a sound that somehow carried perfect clarity despite the storm's roar, and felt him relax back against her neck. The procession moved with supernatural speed across terrain that should have taken hours to navigate. The ram ahead seemed to know every safe passage, every stable bridge across the mountain's hidden crevasses. When they encountered a section where an avalanche had recently scoured the mountainside clean, the eagle above cried out a warning, and the path diverted to a series of narrow ledges that Baya's enhanced senses could now perceive and navigate with confidence. As they descended through the storm, Baya began to understand the true nature of the power flowing through her. It wasn't just ancient, it was eternal, woven into the very fabric of the mountain itself. Every creature that had ever called this place home, every soul that had found peace or purpose in its shadow, had contributed to this reservoir of protective energy. Magnus, through his 40 years of service, his countless acts of courage and sacrifice, had unknowingly fed this power with every life he'd saved. The realization filled her with such profound gratitude that tears froze instantly on her long lashes. He had never sought recognition or reward for his work. He had simply given everything of himself to others, and now the mountain itself was repaying that debt through her. They crested a ridge, and below them, impossibly clear despite the storm, the lights of the village twinkled like earthbound stars. Baya's heart surged with hope, but the ram ahead suddenly stopped, his head raised in alarm. Through the enhanced perception granted by her awakened abilities, she sensed what had concerned him. The approach was treacherous, a steep descent over loose scree that the storm had made deadly. The golden eagle above let out another cry and began to spiral downward. As it descended, its wings seemed to grow broader, its form more luminous, until it was no longer quite bird nor quite spirit, but something between. It landed on the path ahead and looked directly at Baya with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. Without words, she understood. The final descent required a leap of faith that would test the very limits of the power flowing through her. She would have to trust completely in abilities she was only beginning to comprehend, carrying her beloved human companion into a dive that would either deliver them safely to help or claim them both. Magnus stirred again, and this time his hand moved slightly against her neck, a gesture so familiar it nearly broke her heart. Even unconscious, he was trying to comfort her, to let her know he trusted her completely. The ram stepped aside. The eagle spread its enormous wings. The mountain goats arranged themselves along the treacherous slope below, their eyes glowing like beacons in the darkness. Baya took a deep breath, feeling the ancient power surge through every fiber of her being, and stepped forward into empty air. The ancient power coursed through Petra's veins like liquid starlight, transforming her understanding of the world around her. What had once been a chaotic maze of wind and snow now revealed itself as a living tapestry of interconnected forces. She could sense the mountain's breath, feel the pulse of every creature sheltering in its depths, and most importantly, she could see the path, not with her eyes, but with something far deeper. Marcus stirred on her back, his fever burning against her thick coat. Time was running short. The gift flowing through her came with a terrible clarity about his condition. His body was fighting a losing battle, and even her newfound abilities couldn't heal what the mountain had already claimed. But she could still get him home. The storm that had seemed so merciless moments before now felt different. Petra understood its rhythm, could anticipate the lulls between the fierce gusts. She moved with supernatural grace through the deep snow, her hooves finding purchase on ice-slicked rocks that should have been treacherous. Each step was guided by an intuition that transcended ordinary animal instinct. Behind her she sensed, rather than heard, the approach of something else moving through the storm. The presence felt ancient and watchful, neither hostile nor particularly benevolent. The mountain itself seemed to be following their progress, curious about this small donkey who had somehow awakened abilities that had slumbered for generations. "Easy, girl," Marcus mumbled against her neck, his voice barely audible over the wind. Don't push too hard. Weather's breaking soon." Even in his delirium, he was still trying to take care of her. Petra's heart ached with fierce protectiveness. She had watched this man risk everything countless times to bring strangers home safely. Now it was her turn to be the rescuer. The path ahead split into 3 directions, each disappearing into the white void. To mortal senses, all 3 looked equally impassable. But with her enhanced perception, Petra could see the invisible currents of safety and danger flowing around each route. The leftmost path led toward a cliff face hidden by snow. The middle route would take them through an area where the wind created deadly downdrafts, but the rightmost path, narrow and treacherous as it appeared, would lead them down toward the tree line, where the worst of the storm's fury would be broken. She chose the right path without hesitation, her confidence startling even herself. As they descended, the quality of the air began to change subtly. The wind still howled, but its bite was less vicious. Snow still fell, but not with the same blinding intensity. Marcus's breathing had grown more labored. Each exhalation created a small cloud of vapor that was quickly snatched away by the wind. Petra could feel his grip loosening as exhaustion and illness took their toll. She adjusted her gait, moving as smoothly as possible to avoid jostling him. The ancient power wasn't just enhancing her navigation abilities, She found she could somehow share her own vitality with Marcus, lending him strength even as it drained her own reserves. It was a dangerous gamble. If she gave too much, they would both collapse in the snow. But if she gave too little, he might not survive long enough to reach help. A stand of pine trees materialized out of the storm like dark sentinels. Petra recognized this place. They were only 2 miles from the mountain rescue station now. The familiar landmarks filled her with renewed determination, even as the mystical energy within her began to ebb. She had pushed the ancient gift to its limits, and it was starting to fade. The storm seemed reluctant to release its grip on them. As they moved through the trees, the wind shifted direction unpredictably, sending branches crashing down around them. Petra dodged and weaved with reflexes that were still supernaturally sharp, protecting both herself and her precious burden. Marcus suddenly straightened slightly, his head lifting. "Lights," he whispered. "I can see lights." Petra looked ahead and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Through the trees, barely visible through the snow, the warm glow of the rescue station windows beckoned like a beacon of hope. They had made it. But even as relief flooded through her, Petra realized the final challenge lay ahead. The last half-mile was across open ground, where the storm still raged with undiminished fury. The ancient power within her was almost completely spent, leaving her to rely once again on her own considerable but ordinary donkey strength and determination. Marcus slumped forward again, his fever spiking. She could feel him slipping away, his life force dimming like a candle in the wind. The rescue station was so close now that she could make out individual figures moving behind the lit windows. Other rescuers, probably coordinating search efforts for the very man she carried on her back. Petra took a deep breath and stepped out of the tree line into the full force of the storm for what she desperately hoped would be the final time. The ancient warmth flowing through Greta's veins carried whispers of knowledge that seemed to come from the mountain itself. As she pressed forward through the relentless storm, the wind no longer felt like an enemy seeking to tear her apart. Instead, it spoke to her in languages older than human memory, telling her of hidden paths and sheltered places carved into the stone by centuries of weather and time. Her hooves found purchase on surfaces that should have been treacherous, each step guided by an instinct she had never possessed before. The golden light emanating from beneath her shaggy coat pulsed in rhythm with something deep within the mountain's core, as if she had become part of an ancient conversation between earth and sky. Behind her, Henrik's breathing had grown more labored despite the makeshift shelter she provided. The sled runners carved twin furrows through the accumulating snow, and she could feel his weight shifting as consciousness drifted in and out like a tide. Time was running short, but the voice within her, maternal, powerful, eternal, urged her onward with patient determination. "The old ways are not forgotten," the voice whispered, as Greta navigated around a cluster of ice-laden boulders. "What sleeps can be awakened, what is lost can be found again." Through the swirling white chaos, shapes began to emerge that defied the storm's attempts at concealment. Greta's enhanced vision picked out the dark mouth of a cave system Henrik had mentioned in his stories but never found, passages that the old-timers claimed held healing properties, dismissed by modern rescue teams as folklore and superstition. The entrance yawned before them like a portal to another world, its depths untouched by the blizzard's fury. As Greta pulled the sled inside, the sudden absence of wind felt profound, almost sacred. The golden light radiating from her coat illuminated rough-hewn walls covered in markings that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering glow, symbols that spoke of protection, healing, and the enduring bond between those who serve and those who are served. She worked quickly to unhitch herself from the sled, her movements sure and purposeful despite the alien knowledge flowing through her mind. Henrik's face had taken on a waxy pallor that sent spikes of fear through her enhanced awareness. The frostbite on his exposed fingers had worsened, and his breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. Drawing upon instincts that felt both foreign and familiar, Greta positioned herself beside Henrik's still form. The warmth radiating from her body seemed to intensify as she settled against him, wrapping him in a cocoon of supernatural heat that penetrated deeper than any blanket or fire could reach. But she sensed that warmth alone would not be enough. The cave walls pulsed with a subtle rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and the ancient markings began to glow with the same golden light that coursed through her veins. Understanding bloomed within her like a flower opening to sunlight. This place was not merely shelter, but a nexus where the boundary between the mortal world and something far older grew thin. Greta lowered her great head until her forehead touched Henrik's chest, directly over his laboring heart. The contact sent a surge of power through both of them, and she felt the mountain itself respond to her call. Energy flowed from the stone beneath them, up through her body, and into the man who had devoted his life to protecting others in these treacherous heights. Henrik's breathing steadied, growing deeper and more regular. Color began to return to his face as the mysterious force worked to heal the damage inflicted by cold and exhaustion. But Greta could feel the effort drawing something vital from her own essence, as if she were pouring her very life force into keeping him alive. "The debt must be balanced," the ancient voice whispered, its tone gentle but implacable. Service given, service returned. Love offered, love repaid. She understood now why this power had remained hidden, why it emerged only in moments of desperate need. It demanded sacrifice, not of life itself, but of the simple existence she had known before. The magic would forever mark her as something beyond the ordinary, a guardian touched by forces that most would never comprehend. Henrik's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but gradually gaining clarity. When his gaze found hers in the golden glow, she saw recognition dawn, not just of her presence, but of what she had become. His weathered hand reached up to touch her neck, and she felt tears freeze instantly on his cheeks. "My faithful friend," he whispered, his voice hoarse but growing stronger. "What have you done?" The storm continued to rage outside their sanctuary, but within the cave's protective embrace, surrounded by symbols of ancient power and bathed in light that bridged the gap between myth and reality, Greta felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. She had found her purpose, just as Henrik had found his decades ago in these same mountains. The ancient power coursed through Petra's veins like molten starlight, each heartbeat sending waves of otherworldly energy rippling beneath her coarse fur. The blizzard that had seemed so overwhelming moments before now felt like nothing more than a gentle breeze against her transformed consciousness. She could see everything, the mountain's hidden paths glowing like silver threads, the warm pulse of life within Thomas's failing body, and most remarkably, the ghostly figures of every soul he had saved over 4 decades beginning to materialize in the swirling snow. They came slowly at first, translucent shapes emerging from the storm like memories given form. A young climber Thomas had pulled from a crevasse 15 years ago stepped forward, his ethereal hand reaching toward the unconscious rescuer. Behind him, a family of hikers lost in an avalanche, their faces serene and grateful. More appeared, dozens, then scores of people whose lives had been preserved by Thomas's unwavering dedication to the mountain and its visitors. Petra understood now why the ancient spirits had chosen this moment to awaken the old magic within her. This wasn't just about saving one man, it was about honoring a legacy of salvation that had rippled across generations. Thomas had given everything to these mountains, and now the mountains themselves were offering everything in return. The donkey's enhanced senses detected the subtle shift in the storm's pattern. The blizzard was weakening, but not quickly enough. Thomas's body temperature continued to drop, and even with her newfound abilities, Petra knew she couldn't carry him down the treacherous slopes in his current condition. She needed to find shelter, and she needed to find it now. Closing her eyes, Petra extended her consciousness into the mountain itself, feeling for hollow spaces, caves, or any refuge that might offer protection. The stone spoke to her in whispers of geological time, revealing secrets hidden for millennia. There, roughly 200 meters to the northeast, a narrow cave system that had been carved by ancient glaciers. It was small, but it would be enough. The journey to the cave felt like walking through a dream. Each step was guided by instincts that weren't entirely her own, as if the spirit of every donkey that had ever served on these mountains was lending her their strength and wisdom. The rescued souls moved with her, their forms growing more solid and defined as they drew closer to their destination, as if proximity to salvation itself was giving them greater presence in the physical world. When they reached the cave entrance, barely visible behind a curtain of ice and snow, Petra discovered that her transformation had granted her more than just enhanced senses and strength. She could feel the cave's interior as clearly as if she were already inside it, dry, protected from the wind, with enough space for both her and Thomas to wait out the storm safely. More importantly, she could sense something else, the remnants of old campfires, evidence that other travelers had used this shelter before. With careful precision, she guided Thomas's unconscious form through the narrow opening, her own body somehow able to navigate the tight space despite her burden. Once inside, the temperature difference was immediately apparent. The cave wasn't warm, but it was significantly warmer than the hellish conditions outside. Petra gently lowered Thomas to the rocky floor, then turned her attention to the most crucial task, creating heat. The ancient power flowing through her seemed to understand her need before she could fully form the thought. Her breath began to glow with a soft, golden light, and when she exhaled over the old fire remains, the charred wood burst into flames that burned with an intensity that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The fire's warmth filled the small cave quickly, and Petra positioned herself beside Thomas, using her own body as an additional source of heat. She could feel his life force stabilizing, no longer the flickering candle flame it had been during the worst of the storm. His breathing grew steadier, and a hint of color began to return to his frost-pale cheeks. Outside the cave, the ghostly figures of the rescued had arranged themselves in a circle, their forms now so vivid they seemed almost alive. They stood vigil in the storm, a silent honor guard protecting the man who had given them their second chances. Some Petra recognized from recent rescues, others seemed to date back decades, their clothing and equipment marking them as climbers from different eras. As the fire crackled and Thomas's condition continued to improve, Petra felt the ancient power beginning to settle into something more sustainable, less overwhelming. She was still transformed, still connected to forces beyond normal understanding, but the initial surge was giving way to a steady, manageable flow of enhanced ability. The real test would come with dawn, when they would need to begin the descent. The ancient power coursed through Esperanza's body like molten silver, every cell vibrating with an energy that predated human memory. Her hooves had grown warm against the snow, melting perfect circles with each step as she descended the treacherous slope toward the village below. Behind her, Thomas lay bundled on the makeshift travois, his breathing shallow but steady, wrapped in the mystical warmth that radiated from her transformed being. The blizzard that had threatened to claim them both now seemed to part before her like a curtain of white silk. Snowflakes that should have stung her eyes instead danced away, creating a clear corridor through the storm. She understood now why the mountain spirits had chosen her bloodline, why her grandmother's stories had always felt like memories rather than tales. This power had been sleeping in her bones, waiting for a moment when love and desperation collided with pure necessity. Each step down the mountain felt both eternal and instantaneous. Time seemed fluid around her, as if the ancient magic operated by different rules than the mortal world. She could sense Thomas's life force behind her, fragile as spider silk but growing stronger with every passing minute. The warmth she generated wasn't just heat, it was life itself, flowing from her into him, weaving his torn spirit back together with threads of starlight. The village lights appeared through the storm like distant stars, golden windows promising safety and healing, but Esperanza could feel the power beginning to ebb. the mystical energy that had sustained them both starting to drain from her body like water from a cracked vessel. Her legs trembled with more than exhaustion now. Each use of the ancient gift extracted its price, and she could feel years of her life flowing away with every miracle she wrought. A memory surfaced unbidden, her mother's voice, urgent and loving, explaining the cost of their heritage. "The mountain spirits give us the power to save lives, little one, but they demand payment in kind. Every life saved shortens our own. Use it wisely, use it only when no other choice remains." But looking back at Tomas, seeing his weathered face peaceful for the first time in days, Esperanza knew she would make the same choice again. This man had given 40 years of his life to the mountain, saving countless souls from the snow's embrace. If her gift could grant him even one more year to share his wisdom, to laugh with his friends, to watch the sunrise paint the peaks gold, it was a trade she would make gladly. Esperanza felt the last of the ancient power leave her body as willing arms took Tomas's weight. Her legs buckled, and she sank into the snow, suddenly just a tired old donkey who had pushed herself far beyond normal limits. The mystical warmth faded from her hooves, leaving them ordinary once more, and the storm closed in around the village like a fist, as if it too recognized that the magical protection had ended. Dr. Marina knelt beside her, running experienced hands over her trembling flanks. "Easy, brave girl. You've done something impossible tonight." Her voice carried a note of wonder that suggested she suspected more than she could explain. "Let's get you both somewhere warm." As they carried Tomas toward the clinic, his eyes fluttered open for just a moment. Through the swirling snow and confusion of voices, his gaze found hers. In that look, she saw recognition, not just of her as his faithful companion, but of what she had sacrificed for him. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words of gratitude that needed no voice to be understood. The villagers led Esperanza to the stable behind the inn, where thick blankets and fresh hay awaited. Her body felt hollow, aged in ways that went beyond the simple passage of time. The ancient power had burned bright in her blood, but now it was gone forever, leaving behind only the echo of what she had briefly become. As she settled into the warm straw, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the village settling back into winter quiet, Esperanza felt a deep contentment wash over her. Tomorrow, Tomas would wake to find himself alive and healing. Tomorrow, he would have another chance to see the mountain dawn, to feel the wind in his hair, to save another soul from the snow's embrace. The price had been steep, but the choice had been easy. Some gifts were meant to be given freely, without counting the cost. The ancient power coursed through Petra's veins like liquid starlight, each heartbeat sending waves of otherworldly energy rippling beneath her coarse winter coat. Her hooves no longer touched the snow, but hovered inches above it, leaving crystalline impressions that glowed briefly before fading. The blizzard that had been their enemy now bent to her will, the howling winds parting before her like curtains drawn by invisible hands. Tomas lay unconscious across her back, his breathing shallow but steady. The hypothermia had nearly claimed him, but the warmth radiating from Petra's transformed body was slowly bringing him back from the brink. She could feel his life force flickering like a candle in the wind, and she poured more of her newfound power into keeping that flame alive. The mountain spirits whispered to her now, their voices carried on currents of snow and ice. They spoke of the old compact, the ancient agreement between her kind and the peaks themselves. For 40 years, Tomas had served as their instrument of mercy, saving countless souls from the mountain's wrath. Now it was time for the mountain to return that service. Below them, the rescue team's lights grew brighter. Petra could sense their desperation, hear their radio chatter crackling through the storm. They had been searching for hours, following false trails and dead ends, while precious time slipped away. She began to descend, her luminous form cutting through the darkness like a beacon. "There!" someone shouted from below. "Do you see that light?" Captain Rodriguez raised his binoculars, squinting through the swirling snow. What he saw defied explanation. A ghostly figure descending the mountainside, glowing with an inner fire that no earthly creature should possess. For a moment, doubt crept into his rational mind. Then he saw the familiar silhouette, the unmistakable shape of the donkey they'd been trained to watch for. "It's Petra," he breathed, "and she's got Thomas." The rescue team converged on the landing site, their headlamps creating a circle of light in the storm. As Petra touched down, the glow began to fade, her hooves settling into the snow with surprising gentleness. The ancient power was ebbing now, flowing back into the mountain from whence it came. She had done what needed to be done. Dr. Sarah Chen rushed forward, her medical kit already in hand. Thomas was breathing but unresponsive, his core temperature dangerously low. As the team carefully transferred him from Petra's back to an emergency stretcher, his eyes fluttered open. "Petra," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Good girl." The donkey nuzzled his face gently, and for just a moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw something ancient and profound in her dark eyes. Something that spoke of powers older than human memory, of bonds forged in starfire and mountain stone. As the medical team worked to stabilize Thomas, Petra stood quietly beside them. The supernatural strength that had carried them down the mountain was gone, leaving her once again an ordinary donkey, tired, cold, but fiercely protective of the man who had been her partner for so many years. She wouldn't leave his side, not even when the rescue helicopter arrived to airlift them to safety. The storm began to break as they loaded Thomas into the helicopter. Through the clearing clouds, the first stars became visible, twinkling like distant promises of hope. Petra climbed into the aircraft without hesitation, settling beside the stretcher where Thomas lay wrapped in thermal blankets. During the flight to the hospital, Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness. In his fevered dreams, he saw fragments of impossible things, Petra glowing like captured moonlight, the mountain spirits dancing in the snow, ancient voices calling his name through the wind. When he woke, he almost dismissed them as hypothermic hallucinations. Almost. But there was something different about Petra now. The way she looked at him held a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before, as if she had seen beyond the veil that separates the ordinary world from the realm of legend, and had chosen to return anyway, for his sake. The helicopter touched down at the regional medical center just as dawn was breaking over the distant peaks. As the medical team rushed Thomas into the emergency room, Petra was led to a warm stable where she could rest and recover from their ordeal. The veterinarian who examined her found nothing unusual, just an ordinary donkey who had somehow managed an extraordinary feat of endurance. But Captain Rodriguez, watching from the hospital window as the sun painted the mountains gold, knew better. He had seen too much, experienced too many impossible rescues with Thomas and Petra to believe in coincidence anymore. There was magic on these mountains, old and deep and powerful. And somehow, a stubborn old donkey with eyes like pools of starlight had become its guardian. In the stable, Petra dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with whispers from the peaks and promises yet to be kept. The first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold as Marcos opened his eyes to find himself wrapped in warm blankets inside the mountain rescue station. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and though his fingers and toes tingled with the memory of frostbite, he was alive. More than alive. He felt stronger than he had in years. "Strela," he whispered, his voice hoarse but urgent. He tried to sit up, memories flooding back in fragments, the blinding snow, the crushing cold, and then something impossible, something magical. "She's right here, old friend." Captain Rodriguez appeared at his bedside, gesturing toward the corner of the room where Estrella stood munching contentedly on fresh hay. Her grey coat gleamed in the morning light, and her dark eyes held a depth that seemed almost human, almost knowing. "How did I get here?" Marcos asked, though even as the words left his lips, impossible images flickered through his mind, golden light emanating from Estrella's small frame, warmth that defied the Arctic wind, and the sensation of being carried not just physically, but by something far greater than muscle and bone. Rodriguez pulled up a chair, his weathered face serious. "The rescue team found you this morning. About a mile from here. You were unconscious but stable, wrapped in your emergency gear. Estrella was standing guard over you, and when we tried to approach—" He paused, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like it. She had this protective circle around you, and the snow within it had melted completely. The ground was warm to the touch." Marcos turned to look at Estrella, who lifted her head and met his gaze. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw golden fire dancing in her eyes, ancient and wise. Then she snorted softly and returned to her breakfast, looking like nothing more than an ordinary mountain donkey. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "The avalanche you were trying to outrun, it stopped. Just stopped. About 50 feet from where we found you, the snow wall is still standing there, like it hit some kind of invisible barrier." A young paramedic entered the room, her eyes bright with excitement. "Senor Valdez, your vital signs are remarkable. Your core temperature is perfectly normal, and there's no sign of hypothermia or frostbite. It's like you were never exposed to the storm at all." Marcos nodded absently, his mind struggling to process what had happened. He remembered the moment when death seemed certain, when the cold had seeped so deep into his bones that he could barely think. And then Estrella had touched her nose to his hand, and everything had changed. Over the following days, as news of the miraculous rescue spread through the mountain villages, people began to share stories that had been whispered for generations. Tales of a sacred bloodline among the mountain animals, creatures chosen by the old spirits to serve as guardians, donkeys who could sense avalanches days before they struck, horses who could find lost travelers in impossible conditions, and in the rarest cases, animals who could channel the very essence of the mountains themselves. Maria, Marcos's daughter, arrived from the city with tears in her eyes and questions on her lips. As she embraced her father, she kept glancing at Estrella with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "The old woman in the village, Abuela Esperanza, she told me something strange," Maria said as they sat together, watching Estrella graze in the station's small paddock. "She said her grandmother used to tell stories about guardian spirits that took the form of pack animals. They were said to choose one person in their lifetime to protect, someone whose work served the mountains and the people who lived among them." Marcos reached out and scratched behind Estrella's ears. She leaned into his touch, her contentment evident in every line of her sturdy body. "Guardian spirit or not," he said softly, "she's been my partner for 8 years. She's helped me save dozens of lives, carried supplies through impossible terrain, and never once complained about the cold or the danger." "But now?" Maria asked. Marcos was quiet for a long moment, remembering the sensation of being held by warmth and light when everything else was ice and darkness. "Now I know that all this time, I thought I was taking care of her. Turns out she was taking care of me." As the sun set behind the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of purple and gold, Marcos made a decision that had been building in his heart for months. It was time to pass the torch to younger hands, to step back from the active rescue work that had defined his life. But he would stay here in the mountains he loved, training the next generation, sharing his knowledge and spending his remaining years with the small grey donkey who had shown him that the greatest acts of heroism often came from the most unexpected sources. Estrella nickered softly in the gathering dusk, and for just a moment Marcos could have sworn he saw starlight dancing in her eyes.